Socialism, the monster hiding under America's bed. Our chupacabra, our Candyman. Say it 3 times into a mirror and your kid goes to college for free.
Yeah, for free. Until you look at your pay stub and you compare how much you earned versus how much you keep.
Americans are so used to demonizing socialism that most don't really know what it is.
Well, I'll agree with you that a lot of people don't know what socialism is. That's largely due to the fact that the people who advocate for it can't come forward with a straight definition. It seems like everyone who advocates for socialism likes to define it differently, so it can often be difficult to pin down what exactly it is people advocate for when they advocate for socialism. And this is actually a theme we'll see repeating in this video.
Or they're shy to admit that they're curious about it. Like how most adults are afraid to watch the Twilight series because what if they discover they're totally on Team Edward?
Well, first of all, you're talking about a political ideology that has killed millions, as if this were some shitty MTV reality show. Second of all, bitch please, Team Jacob for life. Okay, werewolves are cooler than vampires.
But thanks to a 76-year-old self-described democratic socialist, and now a whole host of candidates running openly as socialists, maybe it's time to understand it. We're looking at some of the biggest myths told about the S word. Hit it, Kate!
Okay, that was kind of cool having the intro done with a recorder. Alright, props for that.
We've all heard socialism described by the right. You wait in lines for hours, you eat what little nutrients are available, and everyone wears the same thing. Why does socialism sound a lot like Disneyland?
Well, in this case, instead of waiting in line to ride Space Mountain, you're waiting in line for fucking bread and toilet paper.
Socialism is a favorite straw man of the right.
Oh, you mean kind of like how capitalism is the straw man of the left?
Used to disparage any candidate that mentions anything that resembles something like generosity.
It's on me.
Patrick, that's my money.
Have you learned nothing about sharing?
Yeah, socialism isn't generosity. There's nothing generous about taking other people's money by force. There's no sacrifice involved. Even the most greedy, selfish bastard would be willing to point a gun at someone and say, give your money to the poor or else. That doesn't say anything about his character. You want to be generous? Reach into your own wallet to help the poor.
Whether it's Barack Obama or Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders, generous? Yeah, don't make me laugh. Yeah, this is the guy who likes to morally grandstand about how the rich have too much and are screwing over the poor while owning a yacht, jet, and 3 homes.
And instead of including socialist voices on television to clarify, they actually have segments like this.
I got to go to the liberal panel. It's got to be tough for you to look at your candidates and see how boring and stiff they are. They're stiffer than you.
Well, they are. Well, thanks a lot.
Fox News features left-wing voices on their show all the time. You've just decided to cherry-pick a comedy bit to try and strawman them as biased. Now, Fox News has its flaws. I don't think anyone doubts that. But when it comes to taking the opposing voice into consideration, they actually do a pretty decent job.
But they did talk about policy, unlike the Republican debates, and it's not socialism. It's capitalism, it's democratic socialism within a capitalist society.
You hear this talking point a lot from the left. Oh, we don't want full-blown socialism, we just want to combine it with capitalism. We want a mixed economy. The problem with that is that it doesn't get rid of the problems inherent with socialism. There's always going to be that lack of market signals to determine optimal resource output. Yeah, putting frosting on a pile of shit doesn't make it any more edible. The other problem here, and I've mentioned this before, is that when the perspective is that socialism is being introduced to counter the flaws inherent to capitalism, well, think about it. If anytime anything goes wrong, whether or not it has anything to do with capitalism, what do you think people are going to blame? The socialism or the capitalism?
You want to talk about giving stuff away?
Yeah.
It's giving stuff. What Republicans do is give stuff to the top 1%.
Strictly speaking, this is true. However, they probably mean as in tax cuts. The handouts that the 1% usually gets from Republicans takes the form of bailouts, subsidies, and regulations to make it harder to compete with them.
Is Social Security socialism? Medicare socialism?
Yes.
Medicaid socialism?
Yes.
You want to take all that away?
Well, no, I don't want to take it all away, just make it voluntary. What's the problem with Medicare competing with private health insurance?
I do. I want to take all of it away.
See how that
stupid
works
panel.
in the campaign.
Well, in my opinion, a policy should be evaluated by how much sense it makes and what results it will accomplish, not necessarily by how popular it is. In a very rare and probable chance that I end up anywhere near the Oval Office, one of the first things that's going to be in my campaign is make Medicare voluntary. This may not be popular popular by voters, but at the very least I'd be sticking by my principles and doing what I think would actually improve things for the country.
I want to take it all away. I don't want the government taking my money.
And that's really all you need to say in order to oppose compulsory taxation. It's my money, I earned it fair and square, and if the government wants to take it from me, they need my consent, just like any private business.
I can spend it better than they can.
That's also true. People typically don't spend other people's money as efficiently as they spend their own. Think about it for a second. Who knows your needs, wants, and circumstances better than, well, you?
And I can't believe I'm yelling at you again.
Oh my God. Greg Gutfeld just lost an argument to an animatronic gag he scripted to make himself look smarter. That's like getting your ass kicked by a punching bag.
And are you going to explain exactly how he lost the argument? See, if you're going to make the claim that somebody lost an argument, you need to explain in detail why it is you feel their opponent was more convincing. Otherwise, it seems like you're brown-nosing more than actually giving it a fair critical evaluation.
Seriously though, there are many different definitions of socialism depending on who you ask.
And this, I feel, is one of its many weaknesses. I mean, say what you want about capitalism, at least we make it clear and straightforward what it is we're advocating for.
And just because a country has socialist policies doesn't mean it's a socialist country.
Well, I mean, what else would make a country socialist other than having socialist policies?
There are degrees of socialism.
Nah, for me it's more binary. You're either leaving peaceful people alone and letting them do with their money as they please, or you're not.
So let's just start out with a safe Wikipedia description. Socialism is a range of economic and social systems characterized by social ownership and democratic control of the means of production. That sounds pretty harmless.
Well, sure, it sounds harmless, but the devil's in the details. For example, how is it that the public came about to own the means of production? Did they create it themselves, or did they take it from someone else who did create them? And is the intention that the social ownership of the means of production coexists with private ownership, or is private ownership not allowed? And if the answer is the latter to either of these, then how do you enforce that? Are you going to use polite suggestions, or is there going to be a gun?
And yet, of course, that's what a collectively edited, non-profit, free encyclopedia would say, and look how that turned out. Oh, pretty good.
Yeah, people often contribute to the public welfare without the need for coercion. If anything, it just proved my point.
You can think about socialism as democracy for the economy.
Well, isn't the free market kind of like democracy for the economy? I mean, if you think about it, you get to decide which business to go to or work with. Nobody points a gun at your head and says you have to pay for this or buy this or go here or do that. It's all up to you. In fact, if anything, socialism would be less democratic because now instead of you deciding what businesses to support and you getting to decide how to spend your own money, these decisions are now in the hands of a council of bureaucrats somewhere with little to no way to hold them accountable.
An economy that takes planning and forethought.
You can't really plan out an economy though. I mean, the needs, wants, and demands of each individual are so unique and constantly changing that any even attempt to centrally plan an economy is doomed to failure. I mean, just think about it for a minute. Take a product that you buy, any product. It could be toothpaste, toilet paper, maybe there's a particular cereal that you eat often, just any product that you buy regularly. Now take a minute to think about everything that goes into making that product. First you have to source the raw materials, then you have to have some sort of manufacturing process to transform those raw materials into the product. This involves coordinating a lot of manpower, equipment, facilities, things like that, and that's just making the product. It also has to somehow get from the factory to your home, and this involves a vast shipping network of like trucks, ships, planes, different modes of transportation, all of which require a reliable source of fuel, and that requires like refineries, networks of piping, stuff like that. And this whole process happens not just once, but every single time you and everyone else buys that product. Now take this complexity of simply manufacturing and distributing one product and multiply it across all the products that you and everyone else buys, and you get somewhat of an idea of how staggeringly infeasible it is to centrally plan and coordinate all of this. And we don't even have to speculate. We can look at socialist countries where shit like bread and toilet paper becomes a freaking precious commodity.
And doesn't just leave wealth distribution to the invisible hand of the market.
So the invisible hand isn't something that people actually believe in that exists, it's a metaphor. It's intended to illustrate the idea that people operating in their own self-interest tend to produce the best overall result for society as if things are being tweaked by an invisible hand. It's a metaphor, not something we actually believe in. I feel the need to point this out because a lot of people who criticize capitalism like to use it as a straw man.
Which, in case you were wondering, looks like this for the 99% of us.
So we could take a nuanced approach and look at all the relevant factors that contribute to to the vast income inequality in America, but that would require us to critically evaluate our precious government that we love to worship so much. So instead we'll just blame it all on the free market. We may not have much of a factual basis to do so, since the United States is nothing even close to a free market. There's regulations and taxes out the ass, but it works for our agenda, so we'll just roll with it.
And yet, instead of having an honest conversation,
The person who just got done blaming the invisible hand for all of our economic problems is now in the same breath lecturing us about having an honest conversation. Just pointing out the irony of that.
about what a more democratic economy could look like,
But socialism isn't a more democratic economy. Someone else decides how you spend your money. If someone pointed a gun at your head every time you walked in a voting booth and told you how to vote, would that be more democratic? See, democracy literally means rule by the people. I can't think of anything that would come closer than people directly deciding which business practices to or not to support.
in a country with the worst income inequality since before the Great Depression.
I'm going to need a source for that. That strikes me as a pretty bold claim. But even if that were true, that we are currently experiencing worse income inequality than during the Great Depression, are people necessarily worse off than they were during the Great Depression? Because income inequality isn't necessarily the end of the story when it comes to evaluating how well off people are in an economy. Think of it this way: would you rather have an equally shared slice of a smaller pie, or an unequally shared slice of a larger pie? Now in my case, I'm trying to shave a little bit of weight right now, but suppose that you're not. I'd imagine the unequal slice of the larger pie, where you end up with more pie, would be the one that you would go for.
We hear this.
Listen up, all you Bernie Sanders supporters. We'll say it again. Socialism doesn't work.
Socialism keeps failing.
This is Socialism 101. We've seen it fail over and over again. It's failing now because of problems inherent to socialism.
So notice how in each of those news clips that they presented, they only showed the part where people make the claims and didn't include any of their arguments? You think that might be for a reason?
Myth number 1. Socialism's been attempted and failed. But has it truly?
Aye, but you see, laddies, no true socialism has ever been attempted.
Critics point to examples of leaders who took a twisted version of Marxism and implemented it to the extreme.
Aye, but you see, lad, no true Marxism has ever been attempted. Those are just extreme and twisted examples of Marxism, not true Marxism. Now shut up and drink your whiskey.
Like Pol Pot of Cambodia or Stalin's Soviet Union. But those are better examples of totalitarianism than anything else.
Well, I hate to break it to you, but socialism and totalitarianism more often than not kind of go together. You see, in order to implement socialism, or at least the kind that you advocate for, requires reallocating resources from people without their consent or banning private ownership of things. Basically, what this entails is giving a group of bureaucrats the unique power to initiate force against innocent people. There's forms of socialism that don't entail totalitarianism, like voluntary co-ops and communes, but that doesn't seem to be what you're advocating for.
As Noam Chomsky, linguist and man who lost award for most desirable lefty grandpa to a younger, hotter Jew, put it,
Korean cars in America are so cheap. I wonder how they do that. Well, my uncle is a mechanical engineer, and he says that it's because they use terrible, cheap parts. You are literally trading money for safety. Straw Mike's uncle might be an engineer, and that's awesome, but it doesn't necessarily give him the authority to talk about the construction of certain parts in vehicles. This is an authority fallacy unless it turns out Straw Mike's uncle is an independent researcher conducting a peer-reviewed study on the international automobile industry and its effects on safety. The authority fallacy trades actual points for external, non-expert anecdotes, the plural of which, you might have heard, is not data. Your uncle seems like a really cool guy, but I bet you can win this argument without him.
the Soviet Union wasn't actually socialist. He says Russia called itself that to trick those sympathetic to socialism, and the US did the same to make people more afraid of socialism.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Wow, we just went into Alex Jones tinfoil hat territory. Assuming that this were true, that there was some sort of elaborate conspiracy to portray the Soviet Union as socialist when they actually weren't, which would require asserting that copious amounts of historical records were fabricated. Again, let's just assume it. This still doesn't account for the fact that countries with freer economies are more successful than those with ones that are tightly controlled. It also would invalidate other copious examples of socialism failing, like China under Mao Zedong, Cambodia under Pol Pot, Venezuela, Cuba, basically all of Eastern Europe, unless of course you want to argue that those are fabricated as well, in which case you'd basically be arguing that there's some sort of elaborate international effort to basically rewrite history, which is probably too big of a conspiracy theory even for Jesse Ventura to wrap his head around.
The core notion of at least traditional socialism is that what you mentioned, that working people have to be in control of production.
And you can have that under capitalism. There's nothing in capitalism that prohibits a business from being mutually owned by all the people who work for it. The workers would get to mutually make decisions on how to run the business, split the profits evenly, basically everything socialists think workers should be able to do. The catch is, under this arrangement, the workers would also be sharing the risks and liabilities as well. You know, convenient how when socialists make this argument, they focus on the benefits that come with business ownership and none of the responsibilities. Also interesting is that when you propose this idea to socialists, like, hey, you can start your own business that operates exactly the way you think it should, that never seems to be good enough for them. Well, what, aren't you guys confident in how well this system of yours would work?
The Soviet Union is the exact opposite of that. Working people had no control over anything.
And that's kind of how socialism works. You give up the right to decide how to spend your money as you please to some council of bureaucrats with a monopoly on authority. It may start out democratic, they may start out by taking what you want into account when they make their decisions, but because they're guaranteed funding and have a monopoly on force, there's virtually no way to hold them responsible. This gets back to that point that I made earlier. Socialism may be implemented with the best of intentions starting out, but because that market incentive to perform well isn't there, it will eventually morph into totalitarianism.
They were virtual slaves.
And under socialism, you have actual slaves. You see, your property comes about as a result of your time and labor. If your property is at risk of being repossessed at any time at the whim of a bunch of politicians somewhere, then you're not really owning it. The government would actually own it, and you just kind of be allowed to keep it. If they own the results of your time and labor, then they own your time and labor, which is literally slavery. Unless I have an absolute right to keep everything that I earn, what you have is essentially slavery. Someone else has the right to time and labor that you perform, albeit in this case they're taking advantage of it indirectly.
Also, why judge an ideology on its most extreme examples?
Well, I mean, you're asking us to make a pretty bold revision to the very structure of our economy and way of life. Would it not be reasonable to at least consider the possible ways it could go horribly wrong?
That's like judging a love of baseball by the Red Sox fan who carved Red Sox into his forehead with a broken Miller Lite.
Well, yes, but that's a single fringe incident of a baseball fan doing something like that. Now, suppose on the other hand that there was a tendency for baseball fans to do this type of thing. Suppose you were able to establish a trend. Would this not at the very least give us reason to believe that there's possibly a causal connection between the two, and that we should probably look into that before we go implementing it? And on top of that, you're comparing the behavior of one individual versus the behavior of an entire society or political system, which is kind of like comparing apples to oranges.
Loving baseball is the least of his problems. Funny enough though, even baseball isn't safe from the myth that socialism has failed. Listen to this announcer calling a Dodgers game suddenly go off on socialism when a Venezuelan player steps up to bat.
Socialism failing to work as it always does, this time in Venezuela. You talk about giving everybody something free and all of a sudden there's no food to eat. Anyway, 0-2.
I wish there were more announcers with a sense of humor like this guy. Maybe then baseball wouldn't be so boring to watch.
Oh my God, I truly hope that somewhere out there is a Spanish language announcer mentioning the failures of capitalism when calling an American soccer game.
Bueno, son malos porque no hay dinero en el fútbol. No es como el fútbol americano donde hay muchos momentos para publicidades.
So I wouldn't call myself a soccer fan exactly, so I may not be too privy on this, but I'm pretty sure you can advertise at soccer games too. What, do socialists think that football has some kind of monopoly on advertising?
El capitalismo vence al deporte.
Capitalism defeats sports? Really? I admittedly don't know much about sports. I'd hardly call myself an athletic person, but the idea that a system where people voluntarily exchange things without coercion somehow defeats all of sports strikes me as a little bit absurd, especially when you consider how much backing that big sports teams get from big companies, as well as the increased amount of leisure time you get to enjoy things like sports, which you have under capitalism.
Piénsenlo. 0-2.
Yes, Venezuela is going through an insane political crisis right now, but it's not clear that that crisis has anything to do with their socialist policies.
Well, the whole political crisis didn't really become an issue until the socialist policies were passed, so I'd say it's a fair inference to draw.
And since that would take another 10 minutes to break down, instead, we threw a couple of links to articles below for you to read.
I know this isn't super important, but this strikes me as a bit of a lazy way to try and condense the video. Yeah, I don't feel like elaborating the arguments I make, so I'm just going to link to stuff in the description. I mean, you can provide a brief summary without extending the video too long.
Yes, read.
You know, condescending your opponents by insulting their literacy is an excellent way to convince them to get onto your side. Wonderful job there.
But what we never hear when discussing Venezuela is how putting their nationalized oil money into social programs led to a dramatic reduction in poverty and an increase in literacy.
Another thing we never hear when discussing Venezuela is how that poverty went right back up once the oil money dried out. That's one of the problems with socialism. Since it's unsustainable, since it requires more wealth to operate than it produces, it basically relies on some sort of cash cow in order to operate. In the case of Venezuela, it's oil. In the case of what liberals want, and here in America, it would be billionaires. Now, the problem that should be immediately apparent to anyone is that once this cash cow goes, so does your socialism. That's why any sort of success that comes out of socialism usually is short-lived.
And how about Cuba? Has socialism failed there?
Considering you won't find a single piece of technology there past the year 1950, I'd say so.
Cuba is not a democracy, for sure.
Oh yeah, that would fix Cuba's problems. Instead of having one tyrant to boss people around, have 51% of the population be a tyrant to boss people around.
But it also has the highest literacy rate in all of Latin America.
That would appear impressive at first, but when you look at the countries being used for comparison, we can see the bar isn't particularly high. Also, a country having a high literacy rate doesn't necessarily mean that country has a good education system. For example, in a lot of countries, people go abroad to get their education and then return. Or you could have a lot of immigrants who are already skilled and educated coming over. So literacy rates aren't necessarily an accurate metric to go by if you want to evaluate a country's education system.
Not to mention free healthcare.
Well, yes, Cuban healthcare is free, but remember, you get what you pay for. The average Cuban hospital is so poorly funded that they have a hard time even getting furniture. Let alone medication or medical equipment, just the fucking furniture. You ever been invited to a party and told it's BYOB? It's an acronym meaning bring your own beer. Well, in the Cuban healthcare system, it's bring your own bed.
And free higher education.
Well, if the free higher education in Cuba was anything to write home about, I'd imagine we'd see students in Florida swimming through shark-infested waters to go to Cuban schools, not the other way around.
And now they're developing a lung cancer vaccine.
Oh really? The Cubans are developing a lung cancer vaccine. Well, the problem with that is that in order for a disease to be vaccinated against, it has to be caused by a virus, and lung cancer isn't caused by a virus, it's caused by abnormal cell growth. Like, even a basic amount of skepticism would have called this into doubt.
And that means they'll be able to safely smoke all the cigars that we can't even import.
Oh, thanks for admitting that the United States isn't a laissez-faire free market.
Instead, we've been left with vaping, which is somehow less cool than cancer.
Ah yes, a safer and less risky alternative to smoking. Another innovation brought to you by capitalism.
Another myth we hear is that socialism is too expensive.
It's staggeringly expensive. I mean, the budget for Medicare alone is like $60 billion a year, and that's just one program. If we expand the welfare state the way liberals want us to, we could easily end up spending over $1 trillion a year. But again, this wouldn't even necessarily be a problem if socialism was sustainable, if it was able to create sufficient revenue to make up for its expenditures, but it's not.
But too expensive for who?
All the people you want to force pay for it? As a matter of fact, the burden placed on the average person by socialism hardly ends at taxation. For example, because of the higher tax rates, businesses have to increase their prices to maintain the same level of profits, so you end up paying more for everything, and you have less choices. Because under socialism, the government either puts their competition at a disadvantage by forcing you to pay for their service anyways, or outright bans competition in the case of single-payer healthcare. So you're paying more and getting less. It's kind of a raw deal if you think about it.
In France, the government covers all or pays back at least 70% of healthcare costs.
Correct. However, that money doesn't come from nowhere. You see, the French not only pay some of the highest taxes in Europe, but all these little unsustainable freebies the government likes to hand out is actually increasing their national debt. In fact, a lot of economic experts are saying that the French welfare state is so unsustainable they could be bankrupt within the decade. How are you going to buy your wine and croissants then?
Which meant a lot when this couple had twins.
Even though the boys were delivered by cesarean section and Nomi spent 9 days in a private room, leaving the hospital they paid
19 euros.
19 euros!
This, of course, only takes into account the out-of-pocket costs. It ignores some of the other expenses brought about by the healthcare system being heavily subsidized. You know, the increased tax rate, the increased national debt, the burden on the economy. You can't really evaluate the effectiveness of a subsidized system just by looking at the out-of-pocket cost. Because a subsidized system, by definition, by the very way it works, imposes costs on multiple places, not just on the individual using the service.
Coincidentally, the dollar price of an Uber ride to the ER in the US to avoid going into debt over an ambulance ride.
Well, who knows? Maybe Uber would offer ambulance services or some type of medical service if there weren't regulations getting in the way.
Compare that French experience to an American couple who went bankrupt after also having twins who were premature.
It was $2.2 million.
Oh, we lost everything. We paid every bill we could. We sold everything we could. We sold our car. We sold our furniture. We sold our clothing. We liquidated our 401ks. We sold everything.
Jesus.
Well, this poor couple was financially screwed for life thanks to our overexpensive healthcare system. It must be the result of that no-good free market. We need to get the government in here to fix everything. Problem is, we don't have a free market of healthcare in the United States. Healthcare is super regulated, everything from hospitals to pharmaceuticals. As a matter of fact, if you want to start a hospital, you actually need permission from other hospitals in the area. You need permission from your competition, basically. I agree that that's a ridiculous amount of money to have to spend on maternal services, but imagine how the scenario may be different in a free market where there were more hospitals and the competition was more open.
But you might be thinking, well, France spends more money on healthcare, and you would be wrong. France spends 11% of its GDP, and the US spends 17.2% of our GDP on healthcare.
That's only a 6.2% difference. It's not really that wide of a gap. And when you take into account the difference between the two countries' GDPs, this gap becomes even less significant. And even if it were true that the United States spends more money on healthcare than France, well, so what? We have a higher population in France. We have more diversity in terms of geography, industry, things like that. Healthcare needs of the average American vary more than that of the average Frenchman. The fact that you were able to find a small gap in a metric that's basically next to meaningless doesn't really strike me as convincing of anything.
And France is consistently ranked as having one of the best healthcare systems in the world, while we clock in last when compared to the 10 most developed countries.
Actually, the United States has some of the world's best healthcare. The American healthcare system has a ton of problems. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But in terms of quality of care, the United States pretty much outranks the rest of the world. Notice how whenever people complain about the American healthcare system, it's never about quality. They complain about the cost or the amount of paperwork. They never complain about the quality.
But on the bright side, Trump is working hard to make us not a developed country, so... Nigga, what?
Really? Donald Trump is working hard to make us not a developed country? I don't remember that being part of his campaign. I don't know, do you guys ever remember Donald Trump promising to make us not a developed country? I want every American to live in a hut. I want every American to have to collect their drinking water from the local stream. And I want every American to rely on burning fires for their heat and light.
What about students? Is socialism too expensive for them?
It is. We have socialism for students here in the United States. It's called government subsidized loans, and they've ended up being nothing short of an unmitigated disaster.
Because in many countries around the world, university tuition is essentially free.
You know, I really hate it when socialists say that their shit is free, because it's not free. Shit requires resources and labor to produce. There's still a cost involved with providing it. They're just imposing that cost on other people against their will. And they know this. The only reason they're calling it free is so that you don't think about this. That's why socialists use the word free. They want you to focus on the benefits and ignore the drawbacks.
In Germany, it's even free for foreigners to benefit from.
You know, I love how socialists on the one hand argue that without taxation, people would just free ride off of public services without paying into them, while at the same time believing that people should be able to free ride off of public services without paying into them.
Like Americans.
I had heard things like I'd be able to drink, I'd have health care. Each month it cost about 600 euro to live here. My room, train tickets, school, food. My main motivation, of course, was saving money.
Was it? Because I'm pretty sure the first thing you said was you'd be able to drink, so I think that's where your money's gonna be going. You can take a boy out of South Carolina, but you can't take a tall boy out of his hand.
Yeah, America has a ridiculously high drinking age compared to the rest of the world. Thanks for once again admitting that the United States is not a laissez-faire free market.
Germany doesn't see free college as a drain on the economy, but believes that investing in young people's education, even that of non-Germans, will benefit the German economy in the long run.
Will it though, or will it just encourage people to go there, freeload off the free education, and then take the skills they learned elsewhere? Because if I lived in a country like Ireland or Monaco, which is not only right near Germany, but also has really low taxes, well, what I do is I just go over to Germany, freeload off that education, and instead of sticking around and getting taxed to death, I just go back to the country that has low taxes.
Compare that to how we pay for school in the United States, which is basically an FU-IOU.
Actually, it's through government-subsidized loans, which create artificial demand for education, thus inflating the cost artificially.
As student debt just hit $1.5 trillion.
And you think that cost would vanish if the government foots the bill? If anything, the cost would be worse if the government paid for all the college. Because now the prices that the universities could get away with charging wouldn't be based on what the students could afford, but on what the government could afford. And of course, the government could afford afford whatever the fuck it wants to, since it can just take your money without your permission. So this is really just a one-way ticket to bloated tuition prices. I mean, we've seen tuition prices increase when the government partially subsidizes college. How would you expect it to be any better if the government fully subsidized it?
Though to be fair, student debt is a job creator for student debt collectors.
You know, before the government started subsidizing higher education, student debt was virtually non-existent. Are you going to mention that at all? Or are you going to keep shoving facts that are inconvenient for your agenda under the rug?
Germany's example flies in the face of another myth spouted about socialist policies, that they're not good for business.
Well, you don't see a whole lot of wealthy entrepreneurs coming out of the Soviet Union or Venezuela.
They stifle innovation.
Well, yes, socialist policies tend to stifle innovation for several reasons. The first reason is that you quite simply have less resources to innovate with since you're paying more in taxes. Second reason is that those resources that you're left with after you're taxed, you're bound by regulations as to how you can innovate. I mentioned this when I was responding to that video by Joe Rogan where he's interviewing Dave Rubin. If you come up with some new way of doing something that's cheaper and more effective but goes against regulation, you can't do it. The third reason is that when the government is monopolizing certain services, that's a direct disincentive to even attempt any sort of innovation in those services. Why bother? The government's just providing it. There may very well be a more efficient way of providing roads, police, fire services, etc. The market's never given a fair chance to bring it forward.
And competition.
Well, socialist policies kind of by definition would have to stifle competition, and they do this in one of two ways. They do it either indirectly through taxation, because, you know, if you want to use a private sector alternative to a government service, you still have to pay for the government service. So if you send your kids to a private school, you still have to pay for public education. If you get your health care through your employer, you still have to pay for Medicare. If you're a member of a union who keeps you safe at work, you still have to pay for OSHA, etc., etc. Suppose that you were forced to pay for McDonald's even if you didn't eat there. Well, wouldn't this put like all their competition, Burger King, Wendy's, etc., at a huge disadvantage? And if not indirectly through taxation, sometimes they will directly outright ban you from competing with them, such as in the case of single-payer healthcare. Look at any single-payer healthcare bill, like the type proposed by Bernie Sanders, and you'll see that one of the things that it does, in no uncertain terms, it says that private companies are not allowed to compete with the government. If the government offers something as part of their insurance plan, no private company is allowed to offer that same thing.
And heavy regulations and taxes only make companies move abroad.
Well, this one's kind of obvious, isn't it? I mean, if you make it more expensive to operate here, companies are naturally going to move somewhere else. It would be like if a landlord raised their rent to some ridiculous amount and was shocked when a bunch of people started moving out.
Work for less. Bangladesh!
Yeah, and I'm sure the people of Bangladesh had a much greater standard of living before people started outsourcing there. Well, I'm sure not many people are chomping at the bit to work in an Oriental sweatshop. I'm sure the people living in those countries would much prefer going home to an apartment at the end of the day versus a straw hut.
But take Denmark. The government spends a lot on job training and education, especially for the unemployed.
I will admit that this is actually a much better way of dealing with unemployment than how we deal with it here in the United States, which is basically just to hand money to people in the hope that they eventually start working again.
And Danish companies participate in these programs because it means they have a stronger workforce.
Correct, and many American companies provide something similar to their employees, such as on-the-job training, tuition assistance, work hours for college credit, for the same exact reason. A more educated workforce is a more productive workforce. Companies benefit when their employees are more educated. This is why we don't need the government to steal from people in order to pay for people's free education. Let the companies that aim to directly benefit from it pay for it.
So when Danes get laid off, they get help learning a new skill that isn't putting together IKEA furniture for strangers. Mostly because they hate the Swedes. In 2015, Denmark was ranked by Forbes as being the best country for business and is consistently ranked as the happiest country on earth.
Yes, but that's not necessarily due to socialism. As a matter of fact, Denmark has, on the whole, lower taxes and lower regulations than the United States. Now, it's true that they do have a large public sector, but as I've mentioned in previous videos, a lot of these Nordic countries are able to have a large public sector at a low tax rate because their economy is so strong. Their economy isn't burdened by regulations like a lot of other countries, so it's more productive, and if your economy is more productive, well, the government can raise more revenue at a lower tax rate. So it turns out the ideal welfare state might actually look something closer to libertarianism after all.
Something Fox News blowhards like Bill O'Reilly desperately try to find a way to undermine.
You know, you gotta love how they get all their examples of counter-arguments from the same source. It's as if Fox News is this oracle from which all anti-socialist arguments come from.
When I heard the Danes were the happiest people on earth, I thought back to my ancestors in Ireland who were beheaded and raped by the Danish Vikings. And I don't know if that was a happy experience.
Yeah, Bill, way to dunk on the libs by bringing up an unrelated grudge you've been carrying with you since the year 800.
You know, this is something I've noticed Newsbroke does quite frequently. They take jokes or things that people said out of humor and portray them as if this is an actual argument being made. Like, if you recall, way back, I responded to that libertarianism video done by Matt Lieb, in which he took a joke made by one of the libertarian candidates about not needing roads and trying to make it seem like libertarians are actually anti-road.
Later in the same conversation, the intrepid reporters hit on another myth about socialism, the "it'll never work in America" myth.
There are 5.5 million Danes.
Right.
And that's it. We have 300 million people here, Bill.
Okay, this myth I really don't understand the logic of.
Really? You don't understand why it's more difficult to centrally provide free shit to more people? Like, that should seem like common sense. Like, that just seems like something that people should just understand. Like, it should be beyond explanation.
If there are more people paying more taxes into a social welfare state, doesn't that mean more money?
Correct. However, you're assuming that the revenue and expenditures would scale proportionally. And since socialism is a system that's heavily centralized and relies on a lot of administrative expenses, and the needs and wants of individuals are diverse, there really isn't much reason to believe that they would scale proportionally.
What? Suddenly Americans don't know how to scale up?
But socialism isn't the type of thing that scales up very well. It's a heavily centralized system with a lot of administrative overhead. The larger and more complex your system, the more administration you need. To use an analogy from biology, why do you think it is that cells split off and multiply instead of just growing indefinitely? It's a simple fact of reality and economics that centrally administering and controlling things becomes more complicated as you grow larger. Isn't it kind of sad how fucking amoebas understand economics better than socialists?
We gave the world Starbucks, Walmart, and King Kong. We're all about scaling up.
Yes, but Starbucks and Walmart are private companies. It's much more simple for them to scale up because not only are they self-reliant, they actually turn a profit, but they also exist within a free market that's very decentralized. And because the market is decentralized, it can essentially scale up indefinitely. Because think about it, what happens if Walmart shuts down? Well, you just go to Target, Walgreens, etc. What happens if we live in a socialist country and the government goes down? You're basically SOL.
Another myth about socialism is that it requires big government, and that government is not democratic.
That's not really the criticism. The main criticism is that big governments tend to become authoritarian, democratic or not. If you look at some of the biggest and most oppressive governments in history, they actually were democratic. Centralizing power in the hands of a few tends to not go down so well, even if you give the public some sort of influence on those few.
But look at Norway, a country whose economic model has been called a 21st century version of socialism.
And that would be a lie. Norway is actually higher on the index of economic freedom than the United States. Same thing with a lot of these other Nordic countries. What you're doing is you're taking countries that are primarily capitalist and laissez-faire and labeling them socialist just because they have a few welfare programs.
And has also been ranked as the world's best democracy.
Yeah, because the ability of a majority of people to violently impose their will on the minority is definitely something to brag about.
After the global financial crisis of 2008, Norway decided not to tighten its purse strings. Instead, under a socialist finance minister, federal control of financial assets in sectors like oil expanded.
So in other words, instead of managing our finances more responsibly, they decided to violently seize private property that didn't belong to them. Yeah, this sounds like an excellent system.
And the government directed that money into their sovereign wealth fund, or national bank, which is part of the reason Norwegians enjoy benefits like universal health care, education, guaranteed parental leave, and oh yeah, no national debt.
Yeah, for now. What happens when those oil reserves dry up? This is the problem with socialism that usually relies on some sort of cash cow, be it oil, rich people, whatever, and whenever that cash cow runs out, the whole system comes crashing down.
As far as democracy goes, Norwegians are automatically registered to vote, and 78% did in the last election, compared to our 55% in the last election. Not that the stakes were high.
She is correct on this point. The 2016 election had some of the lowest voter turnouts in the history of the United States. This actually makes me somewhat optimistic that people are starting to abandon the idea that government is the magic solution to all of our problems.
Norway has 9 parties instead of our 2.
Well, in the free market, you have even more than 9 choices. You have quite literally infinite choices. Socialism tends to take away your choices, regardless of which party is in power.
A parliamentary system of proportional representation instead of our winner-take-all system.
But isn't any sort of democracy going to be, to an extent, a winner-take-all system? Even with more proportional representation, it's still the matter of the majority has their will imposed on the minority. For example, it can't just be, a government-run healthcare system that people can opt into to and the people who prefer private sector healthcare can keep it. No, we have to have the government push it onto everybody.
And Norwegians have reindeer. Can we have nothing?
Well, Norway may have reindeer, but here in America, we have possums. Got you beat there.
When all of the myths above fail them, conservatives always resort to a final myth about socialism, which is capitalism is better.
Well, given the fact that socialists usually not only ignore the copious examples of failed socialist countries, but also point to capitalist countries as examples of socialist success stories, there may be something to this so-called myth right here.
Die-hard capitalists insist there is no alternative to their system.
Well, sure there is. There's nothing saying there can't be socialist or communist communes or self-contained communities or things like that exist alongside the free market. That's the thing. The problem isn't even with communism or socialism. The problem is that you want to impose it onto people who prefer capitalism. That's the problem.
Sure, it's claimed as many, if not more, lives than socialism.
Hey, pal. You just blowing from Stupid Town?
From colonialism to rampant poverty caused by neoliberal economics to, oh yeah, the millions who died in wars fought to preserve its dominance.
None of those things have anything to do with capitalism. Colonization and war are both activities carried out by the state. As a matter of fact, capitalism would most likely actually discourage both of these activities, as not only do they both violate basic human rights, but they're also extremely wasteful and not profitable. For example, some of the countries with the biggest navies on the planet had a hard time keeping control of their colonies. That's how big of a pain in the ass colonization is.
Capitalism is still better.
Yes, actual free market, laissez-faire capitalism is better, not the type of capitalism you're describing, which is where the government basically acts as a private militia to whatever company can afford to buy it out.
Just watch how economist Milton Friedman, the Bunsen of free enterprise, defended his ideology in an interview with a barrage of whataboutisms.
Yeah, and I'm sure all the questions being asked in this interview were completely fair and balanced. There was no leading questions or manipulation going on whatsoever.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
First of all, capitalism doesn't reward virtue, it rewards efficiency. The more you're able to meet the needs of your customers, and the less resources you manage to do so with, the more profit you end up with. Now, of course, there may be additional perks that come with doing it virtuously, but the main thing capitalism rewards is efficiency. Second of all, having a large socialist government actually encourages companies to manipulate the system. When the government's handing out free goodies, there's basically an across-the-board incentive to get more of those goodies headed your way.
And what does reward virtue? You think the communist commissar rewards virtue? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us.
In Norway! We've been over this!
Well, the problem with that is that Norway is not socialist. They have some government welfare programs, yes, but to a very large extent their economy is still decentralized.
They're with the reindeer!
I guess that's why they all went to the North Pole to go work for Santa. They got sick of the socialism.
But if that kind of cynicism is what defends unfettered capitalism...
Actually, what defends unfettered capitalism is logic, economics, and a good 500 years of historical precedent.
Maybe we should rethink it. But listen, I am happy to be proven wrong.
Yeah, forgive me for having doubts on that.
Which is why I'm going to consult my conservative panel. Hey, conservative panel, what do you think about all these socialist myths?
They're not myths. They're not myths at all. Generosity is evil. If you give people free handouts, they're gonna have to eat rats out of buckets. And don't ask me to link cause and effects. Cause and effect is fake news.
Okay.
Mr. Strawman, give me a break.
You know, at least when Fox News used this joke, they actually put some sort of effort into accurately portraying the other side's position. As a matter of fact, I'd argue that's actually what makes it funny when they do it. Well, it just goes to show you that Newsbroke puts the same exact amount of effort into their comedy as they do their arguments.
Okay, listen, conservative panel, I know you're confused and angry because things aren't always black or white. History is fluid, and your president is going down in a fiery ball of lies.
Okay, we get it. You think Donald Trump is a shitty president. Can we please stay on topic now?
But maybe keep an open mind about socialism.
I do have an open mind about socialism. There's nothing saying you can't go start your own voluntary commune or co-op or whatever. Why can't the people who like socialism go have socialism, and the people who prefer capitalism go have capitalism? Why not just do things like that, and that way everybody's happy? Why do you have to force it on the people?
Capitalism is built on greed.
No, it's not. It's built on voluntary exchanges in the free market. Capitalism entails respecting other people's right to their property and their time and labor. In many respects, it's the opposite opposite of greed. Also, a lot of people who support capitalism and laissez-faire economics also support voluntary forms of charity and humanitarian aid. So the idea of capitalism being greedy is simply a straw man.
Which, as it turns out, is not best for either people or business.
So forcibly confiscating people's money against their will and spending it on whatever group of elite bureaucrats decide is good for people in business. You know, when you frame the issue like this, it makes you wonder which system really is based on greed, capitalism or socialism.
Or the planet.
Well, you should know that environmental health tends to be better in countries that are more economically free. For example, under the Soviet Union, water pollution got so bad that some lakes are straight up radioactive. And even to this day, China, which is a country where industry is largely government run, has some of the worst pollution on the whole planet.
Maybe capitalism could use some socialism.
So you'll often hear this argument specifically from the whole social democracy crowd. Oh, we don't want to get rid of capitalism, we just want to combine it with socialism to make up for capitalism's faults. Here's the problem with this. If the mentality that you have is that the socialism is being introduced to make up for the shortcomings of capitalism, then anytime something goes wrong in the economy, whether it's actually the fault of capitalism or socialism, people are going to blame the capitalism because they already have that mindset that, oh, everything that's wrong must be with capitalism. So anytime anything goes wrong, even if it's the fault of socialism, they'll say, oh, it's capitalism's fault. Increase the socialism.
Americans are innovative and hopeful, so maybe the world has yet to see the best of socialism.
Alright then, well I say prove it. If the Soviet Union and Mao's China aren't examples of real socialism, and you think that socialism in its true glory has yet to be seen, then go out and start your own socialist commune. If it ends up working out, if it ends up being successful, then maybe it will catch on, where people will want to join in and socialism will kind of naturally catch on. Instead of just pushing socialism onto everybody and just expecting everyone to believe it'll turn out okay, why not actually go out and prove it? Put your money where your mouth is.
And even capitalism.
Actually, Jesus turned the other cheek to ignore a homeless person.
You know someone doesn't give a rat's ass about what they're doing when they put minimal effort into their straw men, let alone their actual arguments.
Thanks once again for watching Newsbroke. If you haven't heard, this is our third to last video, which is oh so sad.
Oh, it's so sad indeed. I was looking forward to debunking more of your bullshit, but I guess with Sam Cedar, Tom Hartman, Paula Dice, non-compete, etc., there'll be no shortage of material for me to work with elsewhere. You can also help me debunk this material by going on my Patreon page. Link will be in the description. Until next time, this has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.